19-year-old Walid Irani is sitting in his car outside the St. George League's club in Kogarah, New South Wales, Australia. It's December 20, 1999, a Monday night, and he's waiting for a man named Richard Piech to exit the club. In Walid's sock is a knife, and on the passenger seat, a hammer. Some time passes and Richard emerges at 10:20 p.m., but he's with a woman. His original plan was to confront him in the car park, but aborts the mission. He instead drives his car to Richard's home, parks the car, and starts walking toward the target's home. As he passes Richard on the walkway, Walid turns around and strikes him in the back of the head with a hammer. To Walid's amazement, Richard didn't lose consciousness. Instead, Richard looks at his attacker, stunned. Walid then hits Richard again with a hammer, but the hammer breaks and falls to the ground. After the second strike, Richard doesn't even fall. In fact, he fights back. In what appeared to be a last resort, Walid pulls out the knife and plunges it into Richard's chest, piercing his heart and leaving him to bleed to death. The plan was both a failure and a success, depending on who you ask. For Walid and his direct accomplices, it wasn't supposed to go like this. For the ringleader, it was water under the bridge. Earlier that night, Walid and his two accomplices, Ben Sikizi and Ben's girlfriend Casey Salem, were sitting in the club talking about what was about to transpire that night. Walid had just received intel that Richard was in the club. He was also informed as to Richard's whereabouts throughout the night. So he went out and waited in his car. Walid knew various things about the target before this night, including where he lived. 3 days earlier, the trio had driven to Richard's home to scope it out, but were chased by the neighbor who was suspicious about them loitering around. The neighbor took a mental note of the license plate, which was registered to Walid's father. It turned out that the license plate would be a key piece of evidence that would apprehend Walid. That, and the fact that the struggle between Walid and Richard was heard by the neighbor. Walid denied any involvement when he was interviewed on December 23, 1999 and January 13, 2000. He lied about his movements that night and police arrested him on January 25, 2000. It was then that he made a full confession and implicated Ben, who was also arrested that day. Walid said he meant to stab Richard in the hip, leg, or thigh, as he was told to do, but when he realized he had stabbed him 6 times in the upper left chest, perforating his left lung and aorta, he ran, got in his car, drove some distance, and threw the knife in the river. Walid said he was desperate for drug money when Ben contacted him about the job. Walid said he used heroin that day and thought he might have been under the influence of the drug at the time he stabbed Richard, but that he never intended to kill him. He said he took his knife with him just in case something happened. Walid had run-ins with the law before, but none constituted violence. In 1997, he was found guilty of theft in the children's court, to which he had to do community service. In the same year he murdered Richard, he was convicted of shoplifting, being in possession of a knife in a public space, driving an unregistered and uninsured car, and damaging property. He had to do hundreds of hours of community service, pay fines, and do drug and alcohol counseling. Born to a law-abiding family in January 1980, Walid grew up in a stable household, but then he began using cannabis at 13 or 14 and heroin at 15, to the point he became addicted, which affected his education. In his 18th year, he was doing cocaine. He tried to quit twice through programs, but failed. He tried doing his accounting diploma, but dropped out after 6 months. He gave information technology the good old college try, but dropped that after 2 months. He held odd jobs, but none in a full-time capacity for long. So he was attracted to the roughly $3,000 he was being offered to do the Richard hit, just 2 weeks before his 20th birthday. He was described in a psychiatric report as, quote, selfish, impulsive, insensitive to the concerns of others, and at times ruthless. But the report found no severe personality pathology and no mental illness. In his own interview, Ben would give a more detailed account. Unlike Walid, Ben did have convictions for assault. Born in New Zealand in August 1976, he moved to Australia with his father and wife in 1998. His father was a violent alcoholic, which forced him on the street. He did some studies in carpentry, but ended up dealing drugs. He similarly began smoking cannabis at 14, a habit that continued and grew to include heroin and cocaine. He soon became hooked and he needed money to feed his habit. A psychologist found that he might have had a personality disorder with antisocial characteristics. Ben would say that he had received $600 as an upfront payment and a further $500 after Richard's death, $450 of which was given to Walid. They were both promised about $3,000. Ben told police about the instructions he was given that night. Stab him, bash him, kill him if you want. I don't give a fuck as long as he doesn't go to work. Richard had been working that Monday night before he left for a night of relaxation with his female friend. The St. George Club was a place he frequented regularly to drink and listen to relaxing music as he wound down for the night. It was also a short distance west from the Newmans of Kogarah, a car shop in which he worked. While there's almost no information about who Richard Piech was, that is, there's nothing on his background from the court records or from archived newspapers, we know he was a math guy. Richard was hired as an accountant by the Newmans to handle the car shop's transactions with suppliers. In other words, when the shop got car parts, Richard's accounting firm would track and log the transactions so that the suppliers could get paid. He was good at his job, but the volume of work meant Richard needed some help. So he put out an ad. We are a medium-sized financial services organization requiring a part-time accountant to join a friendly team that focuses on providing clients with accurate advice and superior service, said a September 1998 classified ad in the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. You must be a good communicator with a sound knowledge of relevant technology, self-motivated, and have the ability to adapt and react to a variety of client requirements. Sometime later, Richard gets a glowing resume. 20-year-old Sneeza Suteski appeared to be the perfect candidate. Born in August 1978 in Australia to hard-working parents, the 20-year-old Macedonian had been provided for with a good home and a good education. She completed her high school certificate and obtained an accountancy diploma. She was also described as an intelligent woman. It was in January 1999 when Richard asked her to come to work for him at the Newmans. Her official title was Accounts Payable Clerk, working under his direct supervision and sitting in front of him in the office. Her role boiled down to receiving invoices from companies that supplied the car parts and preparing the documentation for Richard's approval so those suppliers could get paid. Sneeza was hired in part because she had the chops not only to process payments through checks, but also via the company computer, which included the banking details of the shop's regular suppliers. Once she received approval from Richard, she would use a floppy disk, yes, those things, on which to write the amount approved to which supplier. The managers of the car shop would then enter numbers in the computers to access the Newman's bank accounts and use the information on the floppy disk to electronically transfer the funds from the shop's accounts to the suppliers. For months, everything went smoothly. The pair seemed to work well together. And then, suddenly, Richard is murdered. As police interrogate the accomplices in Richard's murder, Walid makes a startling claim: that Sneeza wanted to get rid of Richard for 2 or 3 weeks because she was preparing to resign from the firm. So, naturally, investigators needed to get more information from the Newmans. Alistair McIver was himself an accountant with Newman's Information Services division. Basically, his office provided a backup computer service to the car business. Alistair told police that in November 1999 he was approached by a bewildered Richard Piech. The two had discussed some irregular activity in the account starting in August that year, namely that the suppliers had been complaining about not getting paid. From at least November to his death, Richard had been racing to figure out where the money had gone. Sneeza had similarly expressed confusion when she was made aware of the accounts issue. Investigators would then discover that money from the Newmans' accounts was slipping through the cracks starting in June 1999. That month, $3,300 went missing. In August, $29,000 vanished. In September, $34,500 went poof. In October, $29,000 went gone. $73,000 in November, never coming back. Then, in the month Richard was killed, $21,000 went unaccounted for. But the lost money continued even after Richard had been killed. Between December 21 and December 23, a further $31,900 was neither in Newman's accounts nor making it to suppliers. Finally, between January 4, 2000 and January 19, 2000, $66,700 went missing. In just 7 months, the Newmans' bank accounts had hemorrhaged a total of about $289,000. 5 days after the last transaction left the Newmans' account, Sneeza was arrested and brought in for questioning. The smart accountant said she had nothing to do with Richard's murder, but she did admit in part to taking money out of the business and putting it into either her own personal account or in the account of her brother or boyfriend. She admitted to doing the con in 2 ways. The first is that she changed the bank account number of a supplier on the floppy disk to one of her choosing. The second way is that she presented a duplicate invoice to Richard that had already been paid. Once approved, she would then change the bank account information on the floppy disk to the one of her choosing. In total, investigators found that she had siphoned the money through 77 separate occasions. She diverted $164,608 directly into her own account, an obscene amount that was likely the reason she was caught. The rest of the money went to her brother and boyfriend in the amount of $105,000 and $17,592 respectively. While she maintained that she had nothing to do with Richard's death, investigators would make 2 important discoveries. A transaction of $1,791 that was diverted from the Newmans' account to Ben Sakizi, one of the accomplices in her boss's killing. They also heard from her boyfriend, who said she told him in a phone conversation on January 29 that she couldn't come home because she had some guys rough up a guy from her work and they stuffed up and killed him. According to her psychologist, Sneeza told her that she needed Richard away for a couple of days so she could cover my tracks in relation to the fraudulent offenses she had been committing. Earlier, Sneeza spoke to her hairdresser Casey, who in turn told her drug-dealing boyfriend Ben, who in turn told his heroin-addicted buddy Walid, who was in desperate need of drug money. They congregated at Casey's flat in Rockdale Plaza before the murder to discuss what they would do. The court heard the argument that they all wanted to put Richard out of commission temporarily, not permanently, and that the situation eventually got out of hand. But the prosecution argued that Sneeza gave a blank check to the offenders, meaning they could use whatever weapons they liked. When Walid asked at the meeting how she wanted him hurt, Sneeza allegedly said, "Bash him, stab him, kill him. I don't give a fuck what you do to him as long as he doesn't show up for work." Sneeza knew Richard was getting suspicious of her, and her stealing huge sums of money at one time would increase the likelihood that Richard would find out. So she needed to make sure she could leave the company with a stash of cash before he realized what she was doing. So, she gave the accomplices a description of Richard, his age, address, telephone number, car registration, and his habits, including his frequenting of the St. George League's club. Sneeza was so adamant about this being done right, she went to the club with Ben at 7 p.m. that night to communicate with Walid as to the whereabouts of Richard as he sat in his car at the car park, lying in wait. During trial, a psychologist observed Sneeza and found that her personality test results indicate a self-involved individual who would exhibit an intrinsic, unfeeling, cold quality. She would have little investment in close personal relationships and limited insights into the effect of her behavior on others. Her minimal expressions of remorse are consistent with her personality construct. It may not have mattered if Richard was made aware of this personality profile before he hired Sneeza, but there was something else to know about Sneeza that may have saved his life. Okay, here are the terms of the agreement. A person employed by DHL International told Sneeza's father and brother. It was September 18, 1998, 4 months before Sneeza took up employment at Richard's accounting firm, when the two were called into the DHL offices for a serious chit-chat. A couple of months earlier, employees at the shipping company had noticed something unusual. A bunch of money was leaving the company's accounts, and they didn't know where it was going. So they launched an internal investigation and found that between January 1998 and April 1998, $98,000 was siphoned off to somewhere unknown. They discovered that the perpetrator had used a rudimentary way of drawing the money. They would present duplicate invoices to different managers for approval. Once the invoices were approved, the perpetrator would make out a check payable to cash or deposited directly in their account. Then, the perpetrator would fill out the check stub with the name of the supplier so the audit team wouldn't catch on to where the money went. Sneeza was brought into the DHL offices and interviewed under suspicion. She quickly admitted to taking the money and was terminated on July 29, 1998. But the kicker came later. During the meeting between DHL reps and Sneeza's brother and father, the company came up with a resolution. If the family paid back the stolen money and Sneeza enrolled in a drug counseling program, they wouldn't prosecute her. The family accepted the deal. The agreement was signed early the next month, and Sneeza's father quickly paid the money back to DHL. Sneeza then responded to Richard's job ad. Had Sneeza been prosecuted, Richard would have known not to hire her, who, it would later be revealed, had a serious gambling problem. As while the court in Richard's murder trial wasn't so sure about whether or not Sneeza had a drug problem, they knew well that she had an addiction to slot machines and the casino, likely the reason why she needed the funds in the first place. Casey Salem was given immunity for her testimony. Walid Irani pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years with a non-parole period of 15 years. His statutory release was for January 2020. Ben Sikizi also pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years with a non-parole period of 7 years. His statutory release was back in January 2010. In March 2002, Sneeza Suteski was found guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 7.5 years for the fraud charges and a concurrent sentence starting in 2004 of 22 years for murder, with a non-parole period of 16 years, which means her earliest release date would have been January 2020. It's unclear if she was granted parole. If she was not, her statutory release date is January 2026. To think that Richard was blissfully unaware that he had hired a thief and a con artist with no idea of her recent employment because her family had signed a sort of non-prosecution agreement is tragic, to say the least. Sneeza was given an opportunity to correct her course, but she, instead, quickly sought out her next victim, who turned out to be an older man who didn't know he was giving a troubled individual a second chance. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me narrate this story, which is based wholly on the primary sources. Again, special mention must go to the reporters doing the reporting and to you guys for doing the talking. So, as I said at the top, this wasn't intended to be the case for the week, but I had received documents in the other story really late. I therefore had to scramble to write this story, which was supposed to be for an audio-only project because there is almost no audiovisual material. Anyway, be well, do acts of charity, don't be Ben, Walid, or Sneeza, and I'll see you next time.